dear listeners. Today's episode is on Michael Chabon's 2007 swashbuckling adventure novel, Gentlemen of the Road, released the same year as our previous Chabon read-through entry, The Yiddish Policeman's Union. Gentlemen of the Road tells the episodic tale of two Jewish bandits who become involved in a plot to restore a rightful prince to his throne. Set in the historically true kingdom of the Khazars, Gentlemen of the Road is a good old-fashioned historical adventure novel where characters jump onto moving horses, con unsuspecting villagers out of their money, and argue about the appeal of a really good hat. In the afterword of the book, Chabon somewhat jokingly refers to the book's working title as Jews with Swords. It extends Chabon's interest in combining the fluidity of identity with the expansiveness of genre writing. John and I cover where this book sits in Chabon's oeuvre, the appeal of this kind of purple writing, and what it means to be a gentleman of the road. We hope you enjoy the conversation. I think I'm coming down with something, so I might be a little weird this episode. My arms feel weird, and I have like a dry cough, and I feel just like weak. So, like,
oh boy!
I hope I'm not dying. Yeah, anyway, so I'm gonna try. I might be a little loopy, but I'm gonna do my best.
Then, if you do die, I promise the podcast will die with you. I will. Well, let's be real. If you die, I'm going to. We all know I'm going to be immediately killed. Like I'm your courtesan, and you're the emperor of China. And
you have to throw yourself onto the burning pyre
complex. With all your horses
entombed.
1 million terracotta books to protect you in the afterlife.
Yeah, so I have something to do.
That's the infinite library.
Yeah.
It's death. That's the twist, folks.
Yeah, the big twist is the infinite library is when you're dead. So.
I'll have plenty of time to read when I'm dead. With my million terracotta books.
Yeah, I also like the idea that like I'd have to protect them, so I also have terracotta warriors to protect them. It's like, well, they have to make sure nobody steals them in the afterlife. So. My wonderful books must be protected. Finally, enough time.
We're here today discussing another book by Michael Chabon.
Yes, another exemplary version of genre writing from Michael Chabon. One where I think he told himself, finally, I can cook, and then writes his best Michael Moorcock impersonation. Although I haven't read any Michael Moorcock, so I want you to talk about this, John. I liked it. I also want to make the note that along with The Final Solution, which was also genre, both of these examples open with a talking bird, which I felt like almost like was some kind of a tell as to like Chabon being like, I'm about to do genre now. So
yeah, this is definitely a lot. This is kind of him, I guess, in more like pastiche mode. Whereas again, I feel like we talked about Yiddish Policeman's Union felt a lot more like this is a Michael Chabon novel with genre elements. This is a genre novel with Michael Chabon. The bird feels like a bit of a tell there.
Yeah. If we just do a quick rundown of Michael Chabon elements, guy that smokes weed and is sad, talking bird, board game, because Shatranj shows up, which is an early progenitor of chess. Somebody has a bad relationship with their father, and then I think that's all the ones I clock. Somebody's really into books, like is another Michael Chabon.
Hot redhead.
Oh yeah, there's a hot redhead.
Though this time she's like a spoiler. She is like I mean, it is actually a girl, but it's like a girl in drag. So
Right.
it's not a femboy, but whatever the. Actually, I feel like I should know this. There's got to be a term for this, and I just can't think of it. But yeah, not a redhead with big jugs this time. A redhead with small jugs.
But she is the boss.
She's the boss.
So,
yeah, she is the boss. In fact, though, the whole plot of this book is really about making her the boss.
Yeah, and if we hadn't said it, this is Gentlemen of the Road, or as Chabon calls it in the afterword, Jews with Swords, which I'm a big fan of that title, even if, as he says in the afterword, that kind of undercuts what he's doing. I think that's a nice, like just like if you're asking what's it about, you could just say that. Something. Yeah.
Yeah. So Ben, I know you said you like this. I'm gonna go out on a limb here. I think this is actually, as now that we're like more than halfway through the Chabon read project, this is my favorite Michael Chabon book.
Yeah, I think if it's not this for me, it's Wonder Boys, just because I like how repellent Grady Tripp is the main character. And I think Chabon is actually better when the main characters are either heroic in this sense or just like not great. Like I like it. I think having a character who's a good person for Chabon, like not a hero, is like not my favorite bag. So
yeah. I feel like with Cavalier and Clay, that's what we kept finding ourselves rubbing up against, is like, these guys are just, I don't buy them. There's no, there's not enough. The friction here feels forced.
They're good guys. Yeah. Like in Cavalier and Clay.
Nice American boys.
Yeah. Grady Tripp is an asshole. And then like the characters in Gentlemen of the Road are just heroic. So, yeah.
But in like kind of a more Conan-y sense.
Yeah.
Like they choose to do the right thing, but it's kind of a matter of happenstance more than it is like a deep moral conviction.
Yeah, and as they say multiple times, they're kind of scrupulous. So like, and then they'll take whatever pay they can get, and they're not above double crossing anyone.
Yeah. But I think that, so for me, like I said, this is my second time reading this book. This is actually the book that kind of got me back into Chabon.
Oh, nice.
Couple years back, and I read this book. It's I think his shortest for his novels. It's only a little over 200 pages, or I guess without the afterword, a little under 200 pages, at least in the edition I have. So it's definitely like half the length of most of the stuff we've read, except maybe Mysteries of Pittsburgh, which I feel like came in at like 250 or something.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
But I feel like this is the book where I think obviously like he's multifaceted as a writer. Like I don't think he just wants to do one thing, but this is the book where you can just kind of tell like this is one that's just for him. Like he is just having fun.
Yeah.
And like going kind of nutty with it. Like you said, I think in the notes, you know, the like long kind of bravura sentences and paragraphs are kind of back and forth after kind of being on the back burner in Yiddish Policemen's Union, but they are like all they're all being done like kind of almost tongue in cheek, like again, kind of paying homage to like that Robert E. Howard or even maybe like Lovecraftian kind of purple prose of a lot of like the classic pulps. And really kind of blending the best of kind of his high middle brow prose stylings with the like pulp sensibilities that he clearly like loves so much. And I think that when I think about what I really like seeing in this kind of writing, this kind of like genre writing, I want to see people who really love and have like a deep appreciation for what they're doing and like for the genre they're working in, but also do have a real commitment to the craft of writing. You know, that is really where a lot of, when you read genre fiction and it's bad, generally it's either someone who is like hopping on a bandwagon because it's popular, or someone who maybe does like really love writing science fiction or writing, you know, fantasy or romance, but they don't think about their craft at all. And so the prose is just really flat and lifeless. And the only people who are going to like it are people who are, obsessed with that particular like genre register. But this feels like a real, like kind of perfect, like chocolate and peanut butter combo for me. I don't know if this is like his deepest novel by any means. I do think there's some really kind of interesting stuff here about kind of portrayal of history, things we've talked about in the show before. I think it's probably in a lot of ways like maybe a little more shallow on like an emotional register. And so there's not a lot of like relatable like pathos here, like maybe there was in like you said in Wonder Boys, where it's like, oh man, I really see myself in this character or in their struggles. But man, this is just a really fun book. It's a really fun one. Like I love it because it almost feels like a film from the standpoint, like you can read this thing in like 2 to 3 hours. So it's like this is like a great way to like spend an afternoon.
Yeah, and I wanted to mention the filmic thing because I feel like his sentences in this do a lot of stuff. Like in one paragraph, like 8 to 9 things might happen. That's one thing that I think I haven't experienced with him. Because as I was complaining about Yiddish Policeman's Union, I felt like it took like a paragraph for a character to get up and walk across the room. And in this one, there's like 100 things happening per paragraph. Yeah. And there's like all this like teaming activity that it like would make a good film. But also like you'll just keep reading to find out like what's about to happen. And like there is purpley description, but it's usually like in the service of moving something along.
Yeah. No, that's definitely true. I mean, there's definitely like, I wonder, like in the afterword, he talks a little bit like the writing, but I don't feel like we get like a great feel of like what the edit for this book looked like in a way that maybe we didn't for some of his, he's usually pretty open about like his writing process.
Yeah.
And he is here too, but he's more talking about like how this book, like how he was inspired to write it, like what he wanted to portray. And I'm wondering, like, I do wonder, like, was the manuscript for this like twice as long when he turned it into his agent?
That's a good question because it was originally serialized in, I think, the New York Magazine. So like, I wondered if, because I don't think he was writing it as he went along, but much like the Final Solution, which was also serialized, there's a kind of like really tightness to everything that, like maybe it came out in the edit or something like that.
Yeah. Or just like the fact that he knew he was going to be writing it for serialization maybe forced him to be a lot more economical in a way that I think actually suits him really well. Because I think that this and I think Final Solution 2, I think are really two of his strongest. I think that when I have found myself getting kind of annoyed on this read through, it was like, Cavalier and Clay, or some part Yiddish Policeman's Union less so, but like you said, certain points in Yiddish Policeman's Union where it's like I just feel like, come on, buddy, let's move it along here. I understand you can write a very pretty paragraph. I'd like to get to the story, please.
Well, and like with Yiddish, it felt kind of galling, as I've already said, just because like I'm expecting these plot beats and they're just taking longer to show up. And in this one, like I really didn't know what was going to happen. And so like having that action kind of carry you along, it feels very, like you were saying, it's a yarn, it's a romp, it's an adventure. And there's always sort of something that's about to happen in an interesting way. As opposed to being like, okay, now we got to meet the boss. Now we got to get taken off the case. Now we got to like have to,
Yeah, we basically like set up all our like major characters in the first chapter.
Yeah.
Because really we only have like 4 or 5 if you count the horse.
Who is, Hillel, I think.
Hillel.
Yeah.
Well, so I guess I want to talk a little bit about kind of where this book came from, because I feel like it will help elucidate what I think is really interesting about this book, which again is kind of this way it's playing around with history and fantasy, and kind of the way it's working in kind of this register of, I think, like Conan or a Moorcock kind of story.
Well, as a side note, because I was interested. Chabon wrote the introduction to the NYRB of the Longships in like 2010, and yes. So I wondered if he had written it before this, but he wrote it after. So I don't know. I just wanted to make a note of that because I did look it up. But yeah, take the lead.
But I think he'd almost certainly read the Longships before.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I just was like wanting to see if that occurred during the same time, but it was after. So
listeners, for those of you who are unaware, the Longships by Franz G. Bankston is one of the kind of it's a book we're going to do an episode on someday.
We definitely should. It's
one of the books that probably inspired this project, along with like Don Quixote and Moby Dick,
and maybe and Dream of the Red Chamber. Yeah. Honestly, that's a really funny spread of like keystone books for this podcast. Is Longships, Don Quixote, Dream of the Red Chamber, Moby Dick, and then maybe Gargantuan Pantagruel too. So,
but it is. It's very similar to this book from the standpoint. It is just like a rip-roaring yarn from start to finish. Like, imagine what if the Northmen, the not Ari Aster,
Eggers.
Yeah, the Robert Eggers film was fun the whole time.
Was fun and
that bleak register, like the tragic register. What if it was just fun the whole time?
Fun the whole time, and was about like the pagan world disappearing in favor of Christianity as well. So.
Yeah, there's that too. But it's fun. It's fun. It's not in a sad way.
Yeah, not in a sad way.
But yes, anyway, so little digression there. But so like Ben was saying, this book was kind of written as like Michael Chabon wanted to write a kind of swashbuckling story like with Jewish characters. And you know, when I read this book, what really it feels like to me is like, not to get all political for a second, but this feels like Michael Chabon kind of grappling with like Jewish identity in a way that I find really powerful. You know, like we've referenced before in these episodes, Michael Chabon has ended up being surprisingly critical of Israel, the state of Israel, its policy towards the Palestinian people, for, you know, again, someone in kind of his realm and kind of the liberal Democrat-ish like literary world. And this book really feels like he's kind of pushing against this idea that there's only one way to be a Jew. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert on these matters, but I've heard it told, you know, that a big kind of issue in terms of relations between kind of Israel and like the broader Jewish diaspora is like Israel has like a very distinct idea of like what Jewish identity is, and that identity like is very at some level denigrating to diaspora Jews who tend to be viewed as either sort of constantly in danger and needing to like come to Israel to be safe, or, you know, that they have some kind of like liberal effeminacy that would make them incapable of being part of Israel in this kind of greater military project.
Yeah.
And this book feels like it is really like looking back at history to say that, you know, there have been a plethora of ways to be a Jew throughout human history. And there are, you know, by that same token, there are a plethora of ways to be a Jew now. Neither of us are Jewish, but I think that is like still a message that anyone can take a lot away from. We all have identities that kind of tend to be more fixed or fluid, and it's always a good reminder to that these things are always more fluid than we think.
And John, I think that does jive nicely with Yiddish Policemen's Union, which we covered because these came out in the same year. And I think you can see that theme of the fluidity of Jewish identity being very prominent in both of those books. And this one seems to almost take it a step further. But yeah, I think just in terms of like where Chabon is at right now, it jives very closely. And I mean, you could even argue that shows up in Wonder Boys, where they go to the family's house, his I guess about to be ex-wife's house, and they're all like Korean, and like because they were like adopted Korean children, and so it's sort of like a motley crew of people. Like, yeah, that seems to be something he's been thinking about for a while.
Yeah, I think that it's something that has been in the background of a lot of his books. I mean, even I think it's there in Cavalier and Clay with kind of the Central European kind of bourgeois Jew and Joe kind of coming to America and meeting like the working class New York Jew and
there's that thing about how like they don't, like Yosef eats meat and Sam does not, I believe, and that ends up being like kind of a plot conversation point later.
Yeah, but definitely feels like at this point in his career, it's becoming something he's a lot more. Yeah, he's trying to explore more directly in his writing, and I think that I found it a very like interesting and powerful way to express that. Most of the characters we spend time with in this book are Jewish. We see Jews from all over the world, kind of all coalescing in sort of this particular kind of like area of the world. I guess we would say kind of like the steppe almost. But we have, our main characters are a Black Jew from Abyssinia, Amram, and then a German Jew from Nuremberg. Is he from Nuremberg?
I think so. They refer to him as the Frank, right?
Yeah. Which again is I'll get to that.
He's also, I should note, a doctor, and so one of his weapons is a surgical lancet, so that he can defend himself while not breaking his code.
Well, no, not breaking the law.
The law. Yeah.
And like Jews aren't allowed to carry swords, so they have these like absurdly large scalpels made.
Yeah, we don't have to get into it now, but I do like how kitted out both of them are. No,
it's great.
Yeah, they've got some sick loadouts. So yeah.
And then we end up traveling like to the steppe, and kind of a lot of this book is kind of spent dealing with the Khazars, who were like a historically like a steppe nomad tribe that like converted to Judaism for somewhat historically contingent reasons, and kind of the strangeness of this kind of historical arrangement is kind of a big part of the historical backdrop for this book. But yeah, we're dealing with kind of, at the very least, 3 registers of Judaism kind of mainly, and then we're kind of we peek in here and there on kind of smaller pockets of Jewish identity throughout this book, with like the Roditanian Jews, something with an R. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but
not the Radanites or
the Radanites, yeah. And a couple other like smaller groups that we kind of peek into. Like I said, this book is working in like kind of a classic sword and sorcery register, and Ben, I know you're still somewhat of a neophyte to sword and sorcery as a genre.
Definitely a noob, yeah.
But I'm sure you remember, like in our Jarell of Jorah episode, how that first story in particular was working kind of in the realm of like, this takes place in the real world, or a version of the real world. There's this sort of bit where this is like a thing that happened, but it happened kind of on this small level to this one person, and so it didn't make it into the history books, but this took place in kind of the broader flow of our world's history. And the Conan stories do the same thing, but kind of transpose it further back in time, so it's kind of this prehistorical age that then there's no direct record of it, but it goes on to echo through history in other ways in terms of like how people view themselves and mythology and things like that. And something I think this book does that's really cool is it really is kind of saying like truth is stranger than fiction in a way. Like, it's not so much that these are like real people, but I'm sure there are places where he's tweaking things or conjecturing on things we don't have in like the exact historical record. or, just romanticizing a little bit to tell a better story. But, these are all like real groups of people, the Khazars, the Radanites, the, German Jews or Frankish Jews of Nuremberg, the Abyssinian Jews. These are all like real groups that he is kind of taking and being like, no, like the real history here is just as fantastical as what you could imagine. There's this part that I love at the beginning of the book that I'm gonna read. At the word Khazar, the stripling began to nod slowly, and now hope flickered in the peridot eyes. The stripling spoke a few words in a language that sounded like the speech of Turks, and then astonished Zelikman by murmuring a dreamlike phrase in the holy tongue of the Jews. His barbaric accent rendered the words indecipherable, but they remained pregnant with longing, and in Zelikman they stirred the strong desire to see the fabled kingdom of wild, red-haired Jews on the western shore of the Caspian Sea, the Jewish yurts and the pinnacles of Khazaria. Like that is like I love the holy tongue of the Jews, not Hebrew, like not referring to it in kind of this almost academic way we're used to thinking of like classical languages, but treating Hebrew as something that is fantastical. This idea that all these people were united by this holy language that was sacred, and kind of really taking that out of the realm of kind of dry academic history and thinking about like, what does it mean that you have all these people from all over the world who speak the same language on a like for religious purposes? Like, what is that? Yeah. What does that evoke in their selves, in their hearts, like when they hear someone speak it? And even just like the wild red-haired Jews, in their kingdom on the Caspian Sea, like that is every bit as like evocative as like Robert E. Howard talking about like the tribes of Samaria. It's just got this beautiful, it's beautiful language, but it's also just so evocative. And these were real people. Like this is not something that Chabon is just making up. I'm sure, again, like I said, he's taking a little artistic license, he's romanticizing, but that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. And I think too, like having it be in kind of like a steppe area just sort of suggests like wandering adventurers. It's like, it's like historically appropriate that they're also doing this, as well as you were saying, like it's this sort of like fantastical other world that was true, but Chabon is deciding to set the story there. And I like that he's picking up on the like historical necessity of like being a gentleman of the road or something. Like it's a nice, like, I don't know, it gives you like a nice framework while still remaining the sort of like possibility and fantastical elements of like sword and sorcery or something like that.
I think it's kind of interesting is they're both, they're from kind of northern-ish Africa and then like Germany, and they're both going east for adventure. Yeah. Instead of west, which I think is actually, I don't know if that, obviously it's not like on purpose, but I just think it's interesting the way like the steppe kind of, I'm thinking about like Tun Huang right now. And again, that's kind of like a Western almost. And this is also kind of almost evoking similar feelings, but again, they're traveling east instead. So there's almost more of like an Orientalist bent a little bit.
Especially since like the Khazars are considered to be Turkish in some ways. Although I'm no expert and I only did like a little research on it, but it's sort of like the idea of going to this area that's like very complex and dense, but it's still kind of like wild, is cool, as opposed to, going to an area where it might be uninhabited, but then you find out people are there, which is like, the Western.
Yeah. Well, like you said, Ben, we have like two primary characters. This is like kind of a classic like buddy, like not buddy cop, but like duo story. Yeah. As we were both reading this, I remember I messaged you and I realizing that a story I wrote a couple years ago was I subconsciously like ripped off like this dynamic and like basically this whole opening that happens in this book.
And the opening is so good.
It's the bet. I mean, the whole book's good, but I really think that like the first two chapters are kind of the strongest part of the book, just because they set everything up so perfectly.
Yeah.
They're so fun. You know, we're in a tavern, you know, and basically, you know, we kind of open on Amram, who is this like huge, hulking, you know, black Jewish guy. He has a Viking axe called the Defiler of All Mothers that he took off like some, you know, Vangarian guardsman or something.
And he's like playing, like I mentioned earlier, shatranj, which is like progenitor of chess.
Yes. And basically, like, there's a bit of an altercation, and he accidentally damages the hat of his of the other main character, Zelikman, who is described as like, again, kind of like the opposite of Amram, where he is like this gangly
scarecrow.
They refer to him as like a scarecrow. He's always like unfolding. His limbs are so long. Like you said, almost kind of like almost like, what if Elric was Jew?
Yeah.
Elric of Menilbene was a Jew. He's dressed like he's like dressed in all black, whereas you get the impression like Amram is kind of dressed like a pirate, and like a lot of like rich, colorful silks and stuff.
Wait, John, did your edition have the illustrations? Because mine did. Yeah, the illustrations are quite wonderful. They definitely evoke the kind of like, older fantasy, historical sword and sorcery stuff.
Yes, absolutely. They're really great.
I also wanted to mention, John, that I think they say, so when he damages the hat, Amram throws a knife into the hat, and it's said like, we don't know if it's because the bird said something, because there's like a mina that's talking in the tavern, or if Zelikman said something. And that's when I was like, oh, a bird, that means like Chabon's like in pastiche mode, because like, again, I feel like, I don't know why I'm like drawing. And then the shatranj board obviously recalls the chess from Yiddish Policemen's Union, but I just think it's funny that like a talking bird might have, you know, been the impetus for Amram feeling like he was insulted, and then he throws the knife at the hat.
So he throws the knife through like Zelikman's like very nice hat, and like bisects it, basically, like it, you know, almost kind of like a William Tell thing, where it's like, oh, if it had just been like a little off kilter, like it would have killed Zelikman. And then like they get in a fight, and they fight and they duel, and it comes to a standstill, and they get kicked out, and then we find out it was a con. They knew each other the whole time.
Well, yeah, like it's described like Zelikman has the long, as we said, the surgeon lancet, and he appears to kill Amram. They drag Amram's body out to like the stable or something, and they throw it, and it turns out that actually this is a con. They're clearly taking pay from the guy who's, I think, having people bet on who's going to win the fight. And yeah, they're actually fine, and they've been friends the whole time.
Yeah, which just I like, it sets up both these characters so perfectly. Where again, we kind of start off and we think that these are like polar opposites.
Yeah.
You know, Amram is kind of the lusty, you know, kind of big muscle man with the huge axe.
The heavy.
Zelikman is this like kind of sprightly like fencer type, and they're perfectly opposed. And then we find out, oh wait, they're actually like the same kind of guy. Like they're both like cunning adventurers who are kind of on the same page, and they're kind of playing up their differences like to tell a story.
Yeah.
Like it's wrestling, it's pro wrestling.
Yeah, and there's also like a bit where they're fighting, and it's described like Zelikman like rolls underneath Amram and then kicks him in the balls in a way that's like incredibly like with no expression, that like everyone just starts laughing like or something, because he's like seriously kicking him in the balls for like part of their act. But I also love that they immediately start arguing about whether or not Amram needed to destroy Zelikman's hat, because he really does love the hat. So
well, you can tell that like this is like a thing they've done like dozens of times at this point. Like these guys have like a long history. They've done this before. Like there's like patter that they kind of know they're supposed to do, and Amram kind of like went a little too far tonight.
Yeah,
he got a little too into the act, and he actually damaged Zelik's head, and he shouldn't have done that. But it also, again, it shows how skilled they are, because again, Amram throws the knife and he doesn't hit Zelikman like right between the eyes.
And then also, like Zelikman doesn't like, because I think the implication is he has like a fake, Amram has like a fake blood thing. And since Zelikman is so precise, he can precisely hit the blood thing in his stomach without hurting him or something like that. And then make it look like he stabbed him.
Yeah, he has like a squib.
Yeah.
It's like a sheep splatter full of blood or something like that.
But yeah, so the pro wrestling story of these two polar opposites insulting each other and fighting, and then getting the take. So,
but when I say like this is what like I really like with this, like again, this is Chabon like really like grasping the mechanical like aspects of storytelling and really just taking those reins really confidently.
Yeah,
and pulling off like a virtuoso performance.
Yeah.
Like when I went back and like looked at that story that I like, again, kind of subconsciously ripped off when I was writing this, like I don't have like all these turns in there. Like I just kind of have like, oh, these two guys meet in a bar, they fight, and then they become friends. Whereas like this is like doing a lot more kind of rapid fire like turning of things, and
like you think they're one thing and then they end up being something else. Like you think one thing is going to happen and then something else happens. Like for instance, I think they say like Amram's going to easily squash this guy, but since like Zelikman can dodge around, it's like more of a fair fight.
But this really feels like Chabon like firing on all cylinders in a way that I don't feel like the genre elements in Yiddish Policeman's Union felt quite as confident.
And if anything, they felt a little by the numbers. So
this section is just it really like sings for me, because you can just really see the ways in which he's playing around so much with like all these like genre expectations in this way, like feels so confident. And again, maybe not powerful on like deep emotional level, but you're there, you're cheering. You want to see what's going to happen. You want to see what's going to happen next. It feels like the best part of an action movie, and it's the first like 10 pages.
Well, and like and not long after that, in that chapter, I think they get the call to adventure, basically.
No, exactly. Yeah. They go out and they kind of spy this like kind of weedy little guy that they had seen in the bar previously. He kind of like him and like this guy he's traveling with like see them and like kind of realize that they've been conned, and they get upset. And in kind of while diffusing that situation, they find out like, oh, this is the lost prince of the Khazars, and they're trying to, this other guy's like trying to help him get back home, and they end up kind of signing on for this quest.
And it turns out that the guy that is helping the lost prince get home is an elephant trainer, because I feel like elephants end up being kind of an important part of this book in ways that I didn't expect. But they emphasize that he's an elephant trainer in the beginning when this quest kind of gets handed over to them as they're trying to make their escape, having pulled the con.
Yes, a mahout.
Yeah. And so as soon as we get the quest, the mahout is like killed by like a thrown dagger or something, and then they basically like make off with the guy, the prince.
Philak.
Philak. There's a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff does happen in this book. So
like when Ben says like a lot happens in like a paragraph, like after like we finish this chapter, like they're like half a continent away, like within the next paragraph. So this book moves, but because it moves so fast, and the action is like so kind of overwhelming, you do kind of I do feel like I need like a summary in front of me. So we kind of get like Philak kind of eventually explains their story. The Khazars have this kind of very strange like ruling structure where they have like two kings, and one king is like a sacred king who like lives in a tower called the Buljan. He like is never seen by other people. He only like basically like, it seems like his kind of only role is like to be sacrificed eventually. Isn't that
Yes,
what it is?
yes, yeah.
So he's like the sacred king. He's kind of this like holdover of this like older, maybe kind of pagan-ish system that has kind of been is kind of being displaced by the Khazars becoming Jewish. You know, when they describe his tower later, like it has like these totem statues like all over it that feel like they're kind of at odds with like the Jewish prohibitions on idolatry. And then they have the Bek, who is like the secular king, and Philak is the son of the old Bek, who was murdered by, wouldn't you know it, a usurping vizier.
as it tends to happen.
Yes, and so he's like been sold into. Has he been sold into slavery by this guy? There's like a whole like kind of chain of events that he's gone through before this point in the book to reach like where they meet. But he wants to get revenge on this guy and, you know, hopefully retake the throne of the Khazars.
And it's like he's fanatical about the revenge. That's sort of his like plat character, or his, I would say, his characteristics.
Yeah, no, I mean it's he, you know, it's interesting because in a different version of this book, Philak would be the main character.
Yeah.
We'd be in his shoes the whole time. And his like drive for revenge would be like the impetus for, I mean, it's the impetus of the story here, but we stay in like Amram and Zelikman's shoes a lot more, which is, you know, because they're almost more like the like Aragorn and like Gimli and Legolas type characters where they're static. I mean, they're more static. Amram in particular, Zelikman gets like a little development. But Philak is kind of the protagonist still. Like he's the one who like has to like go on like the journey of the self. But we kind of always are a little more on the outside of that journey, which is an interesting choice Chabon makes.
Yeah, that actually reminded me of Dragon Waiting, because as we found out with Dragon Waiting, John M. Ford was like a dungeon master. That's the idea of like giving all of these characters backstories and then placing them in a locked room and seeing where they end up. I was kind of reminded of that in that both Amram and Zelikman have backstories, but yeah, they're kind of fixed. And the character that sort of gets the hero's journey kind of, or the growth into the role at the end is Philak.
Yeah. Because in like the first couple chapters, like Zelikman runs into someone who knows his family, like kind of through all these like Jewish trading networks that are a big part of kind of, again, sort of the background of this book. And they tell him like, your dad's dying. Like he's, like on his deathbed. It'll take like 6 months to get to Nuremberg and you'll be lucky if you get there before he dies, but you should probably do that. And he's like, that guy kicked me out. I'm not going back. Oh
yeah. I remembered it's Regensburg, I think, not Nuremberg, but, okay. But yeah, it's a German city. Yeah.
And that's why he's called a Frank. You know, it's this way. And I think the implication too is that his mother married into a Jewish family, but was of like a more German extraction. Zelikman is like blonde. He looks more like white, rather than looking even like how we would maybe expect like a Central European Jewish person to look. But that's like kind of the most we get of kind of his daddy issues. I mean, there is this way that Philak's whole thing is kind of motivated by his father getting murdered, but it's not quite working in like that same kind of Freudian register that I feel like Chabon usually is. It's much more kind of archetypical. It's not about like, I mean, there's some weird stuff maybe a little later when we get to a little more about Philak. I guess I already spoiled it. Philak's actually the Bek's daughter.
And he's been pretending to be his brother.
He had a brother who was kidnapped by Vikings or something, and he's like, or she's pretending to be him to kind of wield that masculine authority that they feel they need to get revenge. So there is something interesting there in terms of gender. Maybe we can get more into that once we kind of advance to that point in the book. But in terms of kind of like the dad stuff, yeah, we're working in like a different register. Like we're on like an epic register that doesn't necessarily have room for kind of the belly aching, like the Freudian belly aching that Chabon can sometimes get into with
although I do find it interesting that he makes Seligman like a pot smoker, because that sort of allows him to do a little bit of that belly aching you were talking about, John. And I think it's funny that he's a pothead, because on one hand, Grady Tripp, famous Chabon pothead, but also like he can use his medicinal powers to anesthetize people for surgery and also save their lives. So there's kind of an interesting like aspect where it's both a kitted out, you know, character quality, but also it's practical, him being like a surgeon, that he can anesthetize people and thus, you know, save their lives through surgery. So it's sort of like an interesting give and take. And along those lines, like Chabon calls his kit like a pharmacon at one point, which is, you know, sort of like philosophically suggestive, because Derrida talks about the pharmacon as like, you know, the logos that can both help people and cause people problems. And so it's interesting that he kind of uses that in Seligman's character. But I think I agree overall that there's less time to kind of psychoanalyze, and it's more about the quest, the sort of mythic.
Like it's there to set them up as characters. But again, this book isn't about like Seligman dealing with his daddy issues.
Right,
the way that it feels like some Chabon books have kind of been about at core.
Yeah, right. It's definitely it's like a stock theme of Chabon's, but he doesn't play it out.
Yeah. So Ben, you know, I know we've talked a little bit about the prose in this book and kind of the register that Chabon's working in. And as much as like like I said, this is my favorite of his books, at least thus far. Maybe I'm going to be really surprised by Telegraph Avenue. Who knows? But at the moment, this is my favorite. I will say, I feel like we still kind of run into a problem here in the middle, where I mean, there's two problems, I think, and one I think owes to the fact that like you said earlier, this was written for serialization, and I almost kind of regret not getting the chance to read it in serialization. Like I said, it works really, it's still like incredibly fun to read, just kind of all the way through. But the middle of the book kind of ends up being a lot more episodic, and kind of like almost like a very like classic like Bonanza style TV way, where it's like we have kind of little adventures that are really just connective tissue to get us from the beginning to the end of the book. And kind of the events therein are really just kind of like building out these characters a little bit more. You know, we learn that Seligman really loves his horse. We learn that Phelock actually is really good at leading people. You know, we learn that Amram is definitely like the more social of the two of them. You know, it fleshes them out, but it's moving us like through space and time in terms of the plot, but it's not really moving the plot forward.
Yeah, like for instance, they come across a guy named Hanukkah who's about to die because of some betrayal, I believe, that happens on account of some of the troops. And so Seligman saves Hanukkah's life. And so he ends up kind of joining them as they try to take the prince. And then the prince ends up getting kidnapped, and Amram ends up getting kidnapped by a band of people who are trying to save a city from invading Rus. So like not exactly Russians, more like Slavs, I think.
Vikings, basically.
Vikings. And so like they end up kind of finding Amram and the prince, but then there are sort of these dejected soldiers that are there, and then Phelock ends up whipping them up into kind of making a attempt to attack the Boljan. And yeah, so just stuff kind of happens to sort of get the prince closer to the Boljan, basically.
or the Boljan is the Beck. His
the
name
Beck,
is
rather.
Boljan.
Yeah. Sorry, the Boljan, the Beck. Yeah, they need to get the prince closer to him. So like, there's sort of like this trail of events that happens. And as I was telling John, I kind of ended up being sort of swept along in that, even if I wasn't clear that what was going on for a beat for beat moment.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say, I feel like to kind of get to the secondary thing is I feel like this book does occasionally get into the same problem that maybe Cavalier and Clay did, where the paragraphs, like on the sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph level, there's so much, like you said, there's so much happening in a paragraph in terms of action and description and character work, blah, blah, blah. We could have a paragraph that starts like describing the landscape and then getting into like how Seligman feels about the landscape, and then Seligman like shoves a sword through some guy. And that can all happen in one paragraph, and it's all like being done in, again, this very impressive like virtuosic register that we've talked about Chabon having. And there is this thing where sometimes it is very easy to get lost in these paragraphs in a way that, again, to contrast with the last book we read, and again, the book that was written the same year as this one, Yiddish Policemen's Union, like you said, Ben, that book was maybe a little too slow in a lot of places, but I felt like it was a lot harder to get lost because it feels like he is kind of the noir register is working against his instincts. In a way that like the kind of purple prosy pulp register is not. And so I think that there are some parts of this book where maybe Chabon's verbosity kind of gets a little over his skis.
As an example, this is when Seligman is waiting to catch up to Amram and the prince who've been kidnapped. He waited until he saw a small lizard emerge from a fissure in the rock and creep toward a narrow medallion of sunlight on the granite. Then he led Hillel, his horse, up over the rise again and back down into the valley where the tents had been struck and the horses rounded up and saddled and the troops moved out north along the road. Seligman followed the track northward for 5 leagues or more and then came to a barren place where another road branched away, running northeast toward the shore of the Caspian Sea. A small mound of stones marked the presence in this place at one time, if not today, of some ancient god of the crossroads. If you kept on to the north, you would come, Hanukkah had told them, to Atil, the Khazar capital, at the mouth of a river that was also called Atil, through some called it Volga. A fresh trail of horse dung and hoof prints marked the northeast road. The Assyria were bound for the Caspian shore. So just in one paragraph, he sees a lizard crawl towards the sunrise. He rides like 50 leagues to this crossroads, and then he remembers something that Hanukkah told him about it. So like, that's like 3 very important things that happen in just one paragraph.
Yeah, and it could be 3 paragraphs.
Yeah.
I found myself thinking kind of about, it's something that I've been working through in my own writing lately is kind of like, okay, when do you break a paragraph?
Yeah.
When do you just, you kind of, when you're like a kid and you're learning, about like how to do like the basics of writing. And it's kind of like, okay, yeah, every time you finish a thought, that's a new paragraph. And then, especially with fiction writing in particular, you realize like, oh, well, maybe I want to like keep 2 thoughts kind of working in parallel or working in sync with each other. So I want it to be 1 paragraph, and maybe I want to have like a very short paragraph that is kind of expressing the same thought as the previous one, but I want to express it like in a slightly different register or really like hammer home a particular point. And I feel like Chabon, for whatever reason, he loves a long paragraph. And,
really
again, I can see the argument for why he does what he's doing. It's this thing where we see the lizard on the rock, like that is, evocative of movement. It's, Seligman is the lizard. He's emerging from kind of a hidden place out into the open and coming to the, this fork in the road. And then, we do need to kind of know, like, where does the road go? Because that's, again, kind of the point. We're we're looking at two points diverging, and what's at the end of one of them? Oh, it's the Khazar capital. Where is that? What is that? And then we find out it's by the river Atil, which today we call the Volga, or in English we call the Volga. So that is also placing us in, physically in space in the same way that we placed the lizard in space at the beginning of the paragraph. So there's a point to it, but doesn't work all the time. I don't know. Not all the time.
Yeah, and I will find that I like that. I think Chabon wrote this without those guideposts, because I feel like, they're there in Yiddish Policeman's Union. You could even say they're there in Cavalier and Clay, where I feel like you'd be reading and you'd be like, time for a descriptive paragraph, and you'd know that you're just getting like, plate splitting description. But yeah, I will say that sometimes you're kind of just like swept up in everything that's going on, and you're like, where are we going again? Oh yeah, we're trying to get to the Cossack capital. Like, oh yeah, we're trying to find out with this person. So,
well, in this book, I will say that, again, it always feels like there is a point to the choices he's making.
Right.
Whereas again, in Cavalier and Clay, I feel like we kept kind of coming, or I've been thinking of it again. It's kind of this thing where it's like when you see like a really great guitarist who like is doing like a technically really impressive solo that's like going on way too long and isn't adding anything to the song overall.
Right.
He just really wants you to know that he's really good at like doing these particular like crazy bends.
Yeah.
And it feels more like, okay, like you're just spinning plates in front of me and expecting me to be really impressed that you're spinning plates and like riding a unicycle at the same time, Michael Chabon. Whereas in this, it's like, I think because this book despite what we're saying, it is being economical.
Yeah,
like there is an economy here that makes sense, even if maybe we would do it differently. Or again, I feel like the serialization is again very important here in terms of kind of maybe these things work a lot better if you're reading them in kind of shorter bursts. Like I almost kind of want to reread this again, but like do like a chapter a day.
Honestly, John, that's what I did. And because I feel like I found myself, I couldn't do more than a chapter because I wanted to like, I
mainlined it. Like I read the whole thing and like, I read it like half one day and like the other half the next day.
Well, and I think I think because I've been very busy these last 2 weeks, it was like enough to just sit down and really pay attention to one chapter. I think the way he was writing it, and I was like, just one other example of this, because I like this paragraph a lot. So Filak is sort of whipping the soldiers up in this town into a frenzy to kind of get them to ride toward the beck. And the way that Chabon describes Zelikman helping him give this speech is very funny. So the wind of righteous adventure that had begun to sweep through the square subsided as this secret captain and master of the accumulated lore of soldierly skepticism began to explain that any king who controlled both the treasury and the army was, in the eyes of the world, legitimate, and that while no one could know the mind of God, the Almighty had in the past shown a marked tendency in his view to ratify public opinion. If the Rus had treated the towns along the coast between here and Attil as harshly as they had this poor ruin, a rebellion could hope for little to feed them along the way, let alone to swell their ranks. He had just begun to describe the torments that he understood awaited those convicted of mutiny when, taxed apparently by lack of food and drink and the exhaustion of the past week, his eyes rolled in their sockets and his head tipped backward and he slid boneless to the ground, where fortunately for him, his skull was spared fracture by the timely action of Zelikman, who caught him and eased him to the ground, concealing the pad of wadded chamois in his fist so adroitly that Hanukkah was certain no one saw it but him. God has silenced this man and his cowardly counsel, Amram said in Arabic, the mother tongue of the Assyria. Perhaps you would do well to heed this indication of his will. So, in other words, there's a guy that starts saying, maybe we shouldn't do this. Zelikman covertly knocks him out, and then Amram is like, wow, thank God knocked him out. Let's keep moving. But I like that entire paragraph, like, runs through his opinion, runs through him in the act of, like, falling, and then at the end of that sentence, it's revealed in a clause that Zelikman is holding him and only Hanukkah saw him like douse him. Like, that's really hard to do, and it all kind of comes in like one flowing thought basically, and then like immediately to the punchline. So I think like as you're saying, John, it's like very impressive that he's doing this to keep the plot moving, but you like it is sort of is easy to just kind of forget what's happening like in something like that.
Or just to get lost in like the just movement of the words.
Yeah.
And then kind of be like, you get to the end of a paragraph and it's like, wait, where are we now?
Right. And like having that happen in a clause at the end, I think is super impressive, where it's like, yeah, the camera is like going down along him falling and then just reveals like the hand with the whatever chloroform essentially. But yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't feel like it did in Cavalier and Clay, where sometimes I felt like I got to the end of a paragraph in that book and I was like, I don't know what was real in that and what was just evocative description.
Right. Yeah. Everything is real, more or less.
Yeah. Or if it's not real, it's like it's somewhat like evoked that something isn't real. Like again, like that, where it's like, oh, God didn't actually do that. It's a con. Right. Yeah. They're conning these guys.
God has silenced this coward.
Something I do again find interesting in this book is the way it does play with language, which I think that section, it references Amram speaking Arabic. Everybody in this book basically is multilingual. Like I referenced earlier, the role that Hebrew plays in the book. At the beginning, they really can't understand Falak because he speaks he speaks like Khazar in Hebrew, but he speaks Hebrew really poorly. So like Fulak is almost like kind of a dog for like the first 2 or 3 chapters, where they're just kind of like leading him around because he can't communicate with them.
And he's constantly escaping, and they're tying him up and like throwing him back on a horse and stuff. Like, yeah.
And it's really like kind of his like proficiency with like kind of the lingua franca they're using, which is generally seems to be Arabic through most of the book, improves. Like he's able to, again, kind of grow into a more fully fleshed out character.
I also wanted to note, this reminded me, there's a detail in The Kindly Ones where they talk about the Caucasus Mountains. And there's a linguist character in that book who refers to the Caucasus as the mountain of languages. And I think this is like sort of near this area, but I liked getting the feeling that everybody was, or at least these two guys, since they travel so much, are so multilingual because there's so many like cultures in this area.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's this interesting thing where, I mean, I guess kind of like going back to what we were talking about with our last episode in terms of kind of multilingualism, it just is this thing where it is cool that like we live at a time where you can use language this way in writing, and people can kind of understand what you're saying. I don't know. I don't have like a deeper point here. I just feel like it is getting into kind of, the stuff Chabon's playing with here in terms of like identity and, culture, cross-cultural exchange in a way that like feels very confident, because I feel like you said, Ben, earlier, this feels kind of D&D-ish in a way. And I always kind of chafe a little bit. I understand like why these games do it, because you need to have people able to communicate. But, they just come with this idea of like, oh, like the common tongue that just everybody in the world speaks. But then they have like their own like ethnic language that they only speak at home or whatever. And I again, it's just one of these kind of like little historical details in terms of like, oh yeah, like people, being multilingual has been pretty normal throughout human history, but it's always like contingent. And like, just because you can speak like 5 different languages. And if you're talking to someone who doesn't speak any of those languages or only speaks one of them poorly, like communication is going to be complicated.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I like that. It serves as like a great like mode of comedy for a lot of the book. Like in that one passage you just read, where they're dealing with like the army that they've kind of found is like mostly made up of like Muslims, or as Chabon refers to them throughout the book as Mohammedans. Right. Just to kind of again do that kind of thing he does where he's archaicizing to make these things a little more foreign.
Yeah.
And so they're communicating with them in Arabic. And they, end up being able to like convince them to go help this Jewish prince, reclaim his kingdom.
Yeah, and it's implied that the prince is very good at goading masculine people to do things.
Yes.
The prince is very good at doing that. The prince does that to Amram multiple times. He's quite good at that. Oh God! One thing I wanted to ask you before, and we get into something else, is what do you think a gentleman of the road is, John? So I have an idea, but I really do like that phrase. So
Yeah, no, I mean it feels like it's a term like it's a term like gets brought up a couple times throughout the book. I guess it's someone who's an adventurer. It's someone who I feel like it's again kind of this mode that we don't think about a lot anymore because we're so much more casually mobile as a society today. I mean, most people are just because of things like cars and whatnot. But it used to be pretty abnormal to travel a lot. Most people were pretty sedentary, and Jews in particular, in kind of this medieval period this book's being written at or takes place at, because of trading networks and things, tended to be a lot more mobile. I don't think Gentleman of the Road is specifically like only a Jewish thing as Chabon's imagining it, but it's a person who travels, who does not have like a fixed home for one reason or another. And, kind of the curious sense of brotherhood that develops. And I think that there's kind of a way that he's drawing parallels between that and kind of the nomadism that the Khazars like used to have and are still, somewhat engaged in. They have like this one city now, but you get the impression like a lot of them are still pretty much steppe nomads. But they're gradually settling. And so it's kind of this I think it's about, it's people who want adventure for one reason or another. And, that is inherently unstable, but it also creates opportunities that you don't have staying at home.
Yeah, I think my favorite illustration is the one of Hanukkah just lounging in a tent. He's got some stew. And it's like Seligman is like sort of sitting by himself alone, and it just says "a gentleman of the road." Like,
Ben, I saw that, and I was like, "That's what Ben would be looking like if he was in 1500 or whatever."
Yeah, just lounging. Like I got my little hat on. I'm having some nice stew that I cooked up that morning. Like yeah. But it's just like it's a nice picture of life on the road. And I like that Gentleman of the Road sounds very like it's a literalization of some word or something. Like I imagine there's a word that means that, but it's like the literal translation is Gentleman of the Road. And I like the idea of like opportunity, adventure, but also like that means that you have no home. And I think that's interesting because Chabon spent a lot of time thinking about home in Yiddish Policemen's Union. And so I like that he kind of imagines this idea of, like the homeless wanderer who is nonetheless able to fashion a life for themselves, on the road, so to speak. And I think that's a cool kind of like inversion of Yiddish Policemen's Union in some ways. Even though Yiddish was kind of like about that too. So
that's kind of what he's reacting against is this idea of there's a fixed, again, I think he's reacting against kind of this Israeli idea of like there is a fixed homeland for the Jewish people. It's this one particular, it's very interesting. We spend very little time with Jews from what we would today call Israel or Palestine.
Yeah.
There's very few people who are even concerned with quote unquote the Holy Land. And I think it's this thing of sort of this idea of finding who you are in diaspora, in lack of place. It's something that, it's a really interesting thing to think about now in terms of how do people relate to the idea of homelands now? Like, what does it mean to like have a home? Again, like it's so much easier to go from place to place that we're all kind of nomadic, but we're all kind of not. I feel like there's something very interesting in this idea of finding yourself, finding community in lack of ground. I think that again, that's really kind of the core of this duo. That, they're not like they're not lovers, but like Amram and Seligman like complete each other in a way. Yeah, and you get the impression that like they're going to go on to have more adventures like after this point, until, you know, something else changes. And yeah, it is this nice thing. I'm a little curious about like the choice of the word like gentleman versus man.
Yeah.
And I'm not really sure what to do with that particular appellation, because I mean, none of them are like engaged in like classical like labor, like they're not farmers, obviously, like, but
Right.
they are working. Like this seems
Yeah.
like a lot of work.
Yeah, you have to like chase after people and be a horse thief and like, yeah, kill people. There's also a great line where Zelikman says, I am not overly encumbered by principle, as you know. I am a gentleman of the road, an apostate from the faith of my fathers, a renegade, a brigand, a hired blade, a thief. But on this one small principle of economy, damn you, and damn that troublemaking little stripling, the prince, and damn every one of those men out there, living men in full possession of the most part of all of their limbs and humors. I have to hold firm. If we can only save them one man at a time, then by God, we must kill them one man at a time. But yeah, the idea that like the gentleman of the road is on par with like a thief, a brigand, a podcaster even, but that like they're, you know, still like, noble. There's still like a noble aspect to it.
Yeah. No, you know, it's this thing of I mean, I guess it is kind of the classic like romantic image of like the heroic bandit. You know, you're outside society, but you still like maintain this code of honor that justifies your you know, not being put down like a dog by the state.
Right, the nomad versus the war machine or whatever. Yeah, the state and the war machine. Well, do we want to touch on the ending, or should we leave that to the reader? What do you think about that, John?
So I don't have a like I said, I mean, it's a great ending. Like I do think that the reveal, I remember being pretty floored by the reveal of Philak being a girl the whole time. The first time I read this,
I wanted to make a note of that because there's a scene where like Zelikman saves Philak's life, and like the pros is like they looked at each other weirdly, and I was like, huh, like I wonder what's gonna happen. And then the reveal that Philak is a girl, it reminded me of like Mulan or something. Like obviously there's a precedent for it, but it's like the idea of them like having a sort of combative relationship, and then it's like, oh, actually I'm another gender. Like, I don't know. It was a nice third act twist. I don't know, I guess what to do with it on like a thematic level.
Yeah, well, I think thematically, I don't know. I think that, you know, we've talked a lot about like the way that he's playing with like Jewish identity in particular, but I feel like the book is trying to say something a little more universal too about just like about the fluidity of identity and the fact that, you know, we tend to think of things like sex, gender, nationality, ethnicity, religion as these like fixed categories that there's a right way to be. And I feel like Chabon wants us to kind of question those assumptions, because I think it is really interesting. Philak, you know, we never learn their like quote unquote real name. There were on this read through, they struck me as much more of like a trans character than the first time I read this.
I was gonna say that because I felt like her saying that she's both the actual leader of the Khazars and the spiritual leader. It struck me as, it's like a both and thing. Like, something like that. Yeah.
Well, and it's really crucial that at the end they choose to remain living as a man, basically to hold this title. They do not like reveal that they've been the daughter of the Beck the whole time, and kind of do the politic thing. They choose to keep living as a man. Now, I mean, there's obviously like a thing where it's like, this is like a sexist society. She can't do that. But they like step into this masculine role in a way that does not feel quite like a woman like choosing that. It feels like someone stepping into their true identity.
Right.
In a way, I mean, obviously, like all these identities are like contingent and socially constructed, blah, 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 blah. But on this read through, it struck me much more as it felt more like a trans character embracing who they actually want to be than kind of the Mulan thing where it's like,
Right.
oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm doing this out of duty, but really, my internal identity remains as a woman.
Yeah, and I think I think that read is consistent with Chabon's, work or take on gender and fluidity and stuff. So yeah.
And I think it also like raises some interesting questions about like Seligman and kind of, there's references to like he's lonely. He does not feel like he fully, like you said, he's always like getting stoned and kind of like wandering off on his own. Like Amram at one point like says that basically Seligman only loves his horse and like otherwise he was born lonely, whereas Amram is again like this more gregarious character.
Yeah.
And I almost like found myself wondering like is the implication like again now that I've read more Chabon and like I kind of see his particular peccadillos here and there through his work, it's like, oh, is that the gay Chabon? Is that is he in love with Philak as this kind of beautiful, young boy figure, and then when he finds out he's actually a woman, that complicates that attraction. Is he attracted to Amram maybe and like can't express that?
See, that reminds me of a Tumblr set on that I saw on Tumblr way back when about Mulan, and it was just the main guy going, "Am I gay for Ping?" And he's like, "I am gay for Ping." like and then it just like ends there. But anyway, So it raises some questions as to what Seligman's take on this is.
Yeah. But even, I found myself, I was a little struck this time with Seligman's horse, who's described as very strange looking because it's like half Arabian and then like half like steppe pony. And so it's like this very like unusual horse that's both like very fast, but very sure footed. And I was thinking about kind of like these themes of, like hybridity and identity. And I feel like there's just this thing Chabon is doing this through this whole book where again, he wants us to question this idea that there's one right way to be, in particular a Jew, but I think again, in kind of this way that you take that theme and you just extend it out a little bit. And it's like, oh, there's not a particularly like right way to be anything. All these ideas we have about identity and selfhood, they're all contingent, they're all constructed. There are, there's always a multitude of ways to be anything. And, there's immense power you can find in embracing that fact instead of getting obsessed with policing boundaries and, falling into like these easy tropes. Because again, I think that even like looking at the characters, there's this thing where on the surface, they're all these very kind of stock types, but they all just feel a lot richer because he puts in the work to make them feel more three-dimensional. None of them ever quite get to the point of like a Proust character, but compared to again, like a lot of sword and sorcery characters, like they feel realer, they feel more, I feel like when I got to the end of this book, like I felt like I knew Amram and Seligman in a way that like I don't feel like I know Conan.
Right. Because it's like, Amram's very good at shatranj. Seligman is a pot smoker. Seligman also likes commentaries on religious texts. That was a theme that I enjoyed.
Even though he's an atheist.
Even though he's an atheist, that was a nice little sub theme. Yeah, there's I said kitted out kind of like as a joke, but it does really help them feel like, their characters are fleshed out because they have interests and sort of like fixations and like hobby horses, as Lawrence Stern would say, that makes them feel very fleshed out and not in like like a trope or an archetypical way.
Well, as we've worked through his catalog, the more I'm realizing that I really do think Chabon at his heart is a character writer.
Yeah,
I feel like it can get lost in, again, kind of the bravura, virtuoso, stylistic choices he makes. But at the core of all his books, he wants to write about people and the way people interact with each other and with themselves.
I think that also explains how we've talked about how his endings aren't always the best. Like Mysteries of Pittsburgh just kind of falling off a cliff, and then like he dies in Wonder Boys, and then he gets a happy ending, which I'll stand by, but I still think it's a bit of a sudden shift into the happy ending. And then like, yeah, Cavalier and Clay, which we talked about how we didn't really like the ending of that. So yeah.
And I think, again, like this book and Final Solution, and I think Yiddish Policeman's Union to some degree too, tend to have stronger endings because they are leaning a little more into like genre convention. And so you just get like a tidier skeleton that all this is being built around. You know, where in this book, you know, it's a great scene. The Bull John gets mauled to death by an elephant that he abused at one point.
Yeah, and it's also described in one of those like long unfurling sentences too. So yeah.
Like, yeah, this elephant just like picks him up and literally just like bashes him against the ground. And this way that is immensely satisfying. We haven't talked about the Bullshot a lot because he really is just like, he is like the stock like villain.
Yeah.
Where it's just like, he doesn't really, there's no ideology here. There's no, you know, a broader like psychological reason he's this way. He's just, he's the scheming vizier. He's usurped the throne. And sometimes that's fine. It's not every character needs to have a super distinct motivation. It's fine sometimes just to have a bad guy who gets killed in a super a super satisfying way.
Well, the only detail I picked up on his character was that he only plays people at Shatranj he knows he can beat, which is a great detail. He's like, he never plays anyone who's better than him. So
and it's a great villain detail too. Yeah. It's just like, oh yeah, this guy is incredibly insecure in his authority. And yeah, he gets what's coming to him. You know, it's something I did wonder about this as I finished it this time. You know, I wonder if Chabon has I don't think he's published anything, but I'd love to see him come back to these characters, because it does feel like this ends on that kind of classic sword and sorcery thing where it's like the adventure continues,
right?
Or again, maybe in like 50 years time, Molly Tanzer's reincarnation will be paid by New Age Sword and Sorcery to write a sequel to Gentlemen of the Road. But you know, it feels open. Like it feels like these. I would love to spend more time with these characters in a way that I find Sword and Sorcery is really good at, because they aren't the quote unquote protagonist in that sense. That again, Seligman is never going to realize like, oh, I need to go home to Regensburg and like settle down and like that's not what this story's about. That's not
I need to stop smoking pot.
But because they're more static, you can just kind of keep coming back to them in that very classic way. And I would really, honestly, I'd love that. I would really love to see a sequel to this at some point. And I kind of wonder if Chabon has tried that. Maybe it just hasn't worked.
That's possible. I also know that like apparently, I don't know if I mentioned this on the Policeman's Union episode, but there was a script for the Coens to adapt Policeman's Union that kept getting like gummed up in the works. And that thought occurred to me when I was reading this. I'm like, why don't you just adapt Gentlemen of the Road? Like that would be like, it's not as big, but it would be cool. So.
Oh yeah. Well, and I mean, it's already kind of, again, each chapter of this is an episode. You got most of the work done already.
Like apparently like writing. It would be interesting to see if the script for Policeman's Union is floating around, because apparently like it just had multiple production problems, and so then it never got made. But
yeah, that feels like it'd be really kind of tricky to do.
I
feel like there's just like a lot of setup that would just be hard to do in like a filmic register.
It also seems like the idea of the Coens doing it is too easy. They're like, just do Fargo, but more Jewish, you know, like the idea of it being like a winter setting, and it's got that blood and plotting and sort of, cynical take on human nature. But
interesting. But yeah, I feel like this would make a great like mini series. If only we had this idea back when like Game of Thrones was still on TV. We could have made all the money.
So I think we're wrapping up here, John. I did have one more question, though. I did pose this at the opening. He dedicates the book to Michael Moorcock, and as he was saying, he read a lot of stuff a chief among them, Michael Moorcock, and preparing for this. Does this check out as a Moorcockian story, or is there other things going on?
So, yeah, I mean, there's definitely influence here. Like I said, Zelikman is very clearly like, what if Elric was like a more regular dude, even down to like he has a special sword and like he does drugs. But this really feels a bit more of the vein of like Fritz Lieber to me.
Okay.
Like Elric always has like this very like high tragic tone to it. Elric is always like struggling against fate and, has cosmic forces like arrayed against him that he's, it's almost like Nietzschean in a way, that this does like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, which is the series that, Lieber is known for, is I really like those stories because I like this. It's the buddy sword and sorcery series. Like Conan's always solo. Elric is usually solo, and if he does have like a companion, they're probably going to die horribly or get cursed or something, so that Elric can rail against the gods.
It's very also Byronic hero too. Yeah. So
absolutely. Whereas Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, it's a lot more like bad stuff happens, like, but a lot of the times it's like it's buddies getting into scrapes with each other, and you kind of always have this like core duo where that they're probably going to come out of it okay, regardless of how the people around them come out of it. And so there's kind of this like there's this stability that lets you like enjoy the fun and the humor on like a level that kind of these like solo heroes, they almost are forced in this Byronic mode because there's no one for them to like bounce off of. So this feels much more like Lieber to me, but in terms of like the way he's employing his prose and things, I think there are some Moorcock elements here. Moorcock is very good at like making things feel strange and otherworldly.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Even when they're kind of mundane. And I think that's a big part of what's going on in this book. Whereas I think Lieber tends to, again, it always feels like a little sillier or a little more
like screwball, or
not even quite that. Like I want to say pulpy, but that's not the word either, because obviously Moorcock is also very pulpy. But it feels like almost pastiche in a way. In the same way this does. So I would compare this to Lieber more than Moorcock, but I mean, he's clearly very indebted to both writers. But
I just wanted to ask because, like you said, I am kind of a fantasy pulp noob, so it's good to have my bearings.
Yeah, I'd say. I mean, I'm guessing that he dedicates it to Moorcock because I think Moorcock passed away around the time this book came out. I could be wrong about that. I don't have that off the top of my head, but Anyway, well, Ben, anything else you want to say about Gentlemen of the Road before we call it a day? I know you're feeling a little under the weather, so.
I mean, I liked it a lot. I think it's probably sitting at number 2 behind Wonder Boys for me right now in terms of power rankings. So.
Cool. All right, listeners. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We are officially 3/4 of the way through the great Michael Chabon read through of 2024 and 2025. Hopefully the American state will hold long enough for us to finish before we're plunged into Mad Trump Fury. I don't know what I'm doing here.
Capitalism state now.
Fury small hands. Yeah. He's got small hands, folks.
He's got small hands, and he's too old to be doing this.
Mad Trump Fury Doge.
Join us next time as we all go back to school to read Ian Watt's Rise of the Novel. I'm sure we're gonna have fun plumbing the depths of novel theory on that episode.
Yes. Looking forward to that one. We're definitely going to be trying something kind of new again, doing something like a little more like theory / historical, I guess. But hopefully it'll be fun. So we'll see you back here in 2 weeks. And until then, as always, Semper Books.
Semper Books.
Thank you for listening to The Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir.